Welcome to Salvation by Grace, a broadcast ministry of Grace Christian Assembly, a Sovereign Grace Fellowship in Smyrna, Tennessee. For more information, we invite you to visit our website at www.salvationbygrace.org. Now let's join our teacher, Jim McClarty.
Let's do some background. I am not a Roman Catholic. Pretty much everyone in this room is not Roman Catholic. However, there was a time in Europe, 1,000 years in Europe, from roughly 500 to 1500 in big round numbers. There was a time in Europe when Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, was the not just primary religion, but the all-encompassing political embodiment of religion. So much so that when a child was born, his birth certificate and his baptism into the Catholic Church were one and the same. And the reason that you and I today are not Roman Catholic is because of a series of events that took place that involved men who wanted to reform the teaching of the Catholic Church. They perceived that what the Catholics were teaching was a works-based salvation, that if you did enough works in your flesh, God would accept you and save you on that basis. And so there were men who, out of great devotion and dedication to the Catholic Church, said, we need to point out these errors, and we need to work from the inside to reform the Catholic Church. Two guesses what those people are named now historically. You know what they're called?
Martin Luther.
They're called reformers. Yes. They were naming men up here. There. Martin Luther? No, Martin Luther was one of them, certainly. A whole series of men who we now know historically as reformers. Well, when it turned out that Rome was far too entrenched to be reformed from the inside, men like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, these kind of men, John Huss, decided that rather than try to reform the church from the inside, they would separate from the Catholic Church in protest. And in protest, they left the church and began the Church of the Reformers, which is why we now know their church as the Protestant Church. We just pronounce it Protestant now. But most people don't realize when they say the word Protestant that what they're actually saying is protest. Most Protestants have forgotten what the protest was, or why the protest occurred, or what the Protestants were protesting against. Well, long after guys like Martin Luther or John Calvin, long after they were dead, there was a meeting of churches, what's called a synod, or a meeting of churches, in a place called Dort, Holland. And the objective behind this meeting of churches was to hammer out biblical doctrine where salvation is concerned, so that there would be unity in the churches about what the Bible actually does teach. The impetus behind it was that a man by the name of Jacob Arminius, who was actually a student of one of the students of John Calvin, he decided that the Calvinistic approach to salvation didn't leave enough room for man's free will. And so he came up with 5 essential points that he considered the 5 points of doctrine on which biblical salvation were based. The Synod at Dort was gathered to review Jacob Arminius's 5 points, and they determined that his 5 points were not in fact biblical. And so as a result, the Synod at Dort developed 5 points in response to the points of Arminius. And those 5 points have been known ever since as the Reformed points, or the doctrines of grace, another nickname they go by. But the primary nickname they're known by are the 5 points of Calvinism. Now, because Calvinism is the nickname that is given to the primary theology of salvation that grew out of the Protestant Reformation, critics of Reformed theology like to point to the fact that this theology is called Calvinism, and they'll say, well, then you're following a man. You're following John Calvin. John Calvin was long dead by the time the synod that developed these points met, and over the course of months developed the theology, published the theology, and then it adopted that nickname of Calvinism because it was the Protestant Reformation of Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and those men that lay at the very heart of this movement to get back to what does the Bible say about salvation. Because there are an awful lot of theories, lots of conjecture, and a ton of tradition attached to concepts of salvation and biblical salvation. You can line up 20 Christians from 20 different churches and ask them, how are you saved? You probably get 20 different answers because people become very emotional about it and very traditional about it. The Bible's very clear about it. And that's why the Protestant Reformation began there. It began with, let's define how people are saved. There's really nothing more important than to know how is it that people are saved. So we here at GCA adhere to these historic 5 points that lay at the very heart of the Protestant Reformation. And yet when we tell people what we believe, it sounds odd. It sounds foreign to people. I'm going to review one of those 5 points this morning. And if you're not familiar with it, it's going to sound very peculiar to you. Because people grow up with a traditional understanding of how they think salvation works and what they think Jesus was doing on the cross. We all, by nature, start out Arminians. We all, by nature, think that our flesh and our will and our ability is the beginning of our relationship with God. That's just natural. We're egocentric human beings. So of course we're going to start out with me. Me first. If I'm going to deal with you, I want to know what's in it for me. But enough about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? It's the way we think. And so when we think about God, we think the same way. We think, well, it must be about me ultimately. God must have sent his son to die because I was so worth it. It's about me. And so salvation must begin when I want it to begin. And it must begin because I decided it would begin. And my relationship with God must be based on my ability to maintain the relationship with God. We just inherently are egocentric people, and so there is a tremendous amount of theology out there in the world that starts with egocentricity rather than Christocentricity, rather than Christ at the center.